Today, I would like to welcome you on behalf of Dr. Muhammad Al Ali, the COO of Trends Research and Advisory, in this symposium that's tackling one of the key topics that attract the attention of the international world and the international community, which is the complementary relationship between humanitarian works and the goals of sustainable development. Today, we know that the world needs more than ever to highlight the relationship in dealing with crisis and disasters that will have negative implications on the world. This was confirmed by COVID-19 pandemic, which highlighted the role of the humanitarian work as a need for sustaining the national and international security. We would like to, this symposium, to highlight the relationship between humanitarian works and sustainable development and explain the experience of the UAE as a leading experience in humanitarian works and the lessons learned from this experience to sustain the humanitarian and development work and support the international movement for this cause. Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Mohammed Hamdawi to be the moderator of this symposium. Thank you very much, Mr. Sultan. First of all, I would like to thank all the professors and the participants today in this symposium, in this event, despite the fact that they have short time for their work and they're busy all the time. This is the symposium that we're going to talk about the relationship, the complementary relationship between humanitarian work and sustainable development. We know that many countries depend on humanitarian assistance as a way to develop their services to their communities and achieve the goals of sustainable development. The pandemic also highlighted the importance of the humanitarian work in helping the poor countries and also highlighted the role of some leading countries in providing such assistance, as the case in the UAE. The key question remains about the role of these assistances. Are they going to be like real time, or only during the pandemics or crisis, or other crisis, or we would like to have a systematic approach and we have like sustainable goals for these assistances, and what are the roles of the national and international organization in achieving this. I would like also to welcome all our followers on the live platforms, on the social media platforms, and we would try to answer all the questions that we receive through these platforms. Now, I would ask Dr. Hamid Rashid Al-Shamsi to just introduce or to deliver the keynote of this symposium. He's the international consultant of the Emirates Red Crescent in the UAE. Thank you very much, dear colleagues and dear followers. I would like to greet you with the peace greetings of Islam. And at the beginning, I would like to thank Trends Research and Advisory for hosting this event and giving us the chance to present these key topics. I would like to welcome you all. And I say again, it's a pleasure for me to meet you remotely through this symposium as a requirement, or as we are supposed to do this because of the pandemic. I would like also to convey all the best regards of the staff of the Red Crescent for you. And at the beginning, I would like to give you a briefing about the Red Crescent of the UAE, which was established in 1983 and was internationally accredited as the member of 139 of the Red Crescent and Red Cross associations in 1986. I would like also to highlight that His Highness Sheikh Hamdan bin Zayed was the CEO of or the chairman of the Red Crescent, and this gave like support and power, and also a push forward for the efforts of this humanitarian agency that would like that also was enforced by accepting or by having Her Highness Sheikh Fatma as the honorary president for this, and Red Crescent was selected as the second best charity organization in Asia in the last few years. The organization is doing a key role in the national and the international levels to support the vulnerable categories, and without any discrimination, based on religion, race, or ethnicity. We say that we provide the key element or the key factor that will support the life of these communities based on the principles of the Red Crescent itself and based on the policy of the UAE in providing assistance to everyone who needs without any discrimination, whether at the national or the international level, in order to enhance peace and security all over the world. And you see that the developments of the human situation in many countries, due to the conflicts and the impacts of these conflicts on children, women, and elderly, and also the impact of these on the humanitarian operations and processes that provide support to these categories. And we see that some of these teams that provide the assistance are being targeted during these conflicts, and we have many numbers of victims of those guys in many regions like Afghanistan, like India, like Somalia. And this will not stop us from doing our role in providing the support for the victims. In the Red Crescent, we assigned the 19th day of Ramadan every year as a day for the international humanitarian works in the UAE to support the partnerships in the community and also to spread the values and the principles that we are working hard to achieve, and also to discuss the mechanisms to expand and add more values to the beneficiaries of these programs, whether in the local level or the regional or international levels. We also share experiences and discuss the calls for humanitarian assistance all over the world. We know these are our goals, and we are trying to deliver these goals as they were stated by former President of the UAE, His Highness Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan. And we've worked hard during the last few years in order to enhance our strategy and integrated strategy to adopt projects that deliver the sustainability and human development by supporting vital sectors like health, education, environment, and other aspects that are needed by people in the needy regions with all over the world, and supervise the sustainable development project all over the world. And for example, we have the camps that serve the Syrian refugees in Jordan and provide power using the solar energy. And we also established Sheikh Khalifa City, which has 204 house in Hadramaut Governorate in Yemen. This was built to be operated by the solar energy, and also other residential projects in Sumatra also being powered and operated by solar energy. We also have plans to build mosques and residential units in other countries, also adopting the renewable energy. Also, there was another initiative, which is Suqya al-Imarat, which is the targeting providing potent water for needy country or needy people. We started digging wells in the countries and operating these wells also by solar energy. follow up the implementation of the digital school, which was created recently in order to enhance the efforts of remote education and build on the new ideas, and start to have like attract 5 million students all over the world for next 5 years. And also, in order to commemorate the memories of His Highness late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan and the values that he always called for, and his always support for the needy until he passed away from this world, but he stays alive in our hearts, and he left like very big heritage in the field of humanitarian aid, and we would work hard in order to sustain these principles as lights that will guide our roads and for those who help people all over the world. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamid. Personally, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank the UAE Red Crescent for the international assistance and aids they provide all over the world. And as you said about the initiative for digging water wells all over the world, the pandemic highlighted the role, highlighted that so many children were left all over the world without education because of the lack of technology to enable this. At these countries or their own countries didn't have the capabilities and didn't have the requirements to do this. Thank you very much again. I don't want to take long. As I said, for every speaker, there will be about 10 minutes so that we can have like some time to get the question and answers. So the first speaker is Mr. Rashid Mohammed Al-Himeri, Director of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. He is going to highlight the UAE experience in humanitarian works and the principle of tolerance. Mr. Rashid? Yeah.
What a brilliant topic, the humanitarian work and development and sustainable development complementary relation. Indeed, it's very complementary. And allow me here to present the UAE foreign aid as defined by the government of the UAE and the people of the UAE. Allow me to share with you this presentation. Honestly, Muhammad, you're giving me a very short time. I mean, like, how do I like speak about the biggest donor, the biggest global donor in the world, and only 10 minutes?
We'll give you 2 extra minutes, Rashid, if you need to.
Inshallah.
Well, you take the time you need. We'll manage the time, but we want to hear that story, so don't feel pressed by the time, please.
All right, then I won't present. I would just speak my mind of what I have without presentation. All right. So it's very important for everyone to know that the UAE humanitarian or foreign aid assistance started before the union or the establishing of the UAE by a couple of months, where Abu Dhabi Fund for Development, the biggest development arm of the UAE, was established in July 1971, before December, before the union. And that gives you an indication. It gives you that the UAE was established with those values of giving, of sharing, of supporting others. in 2016, the UAE started its first draft. We drafted our first foreign aid policy and strategy, and this was by far the first policy and strategy in the region, just to identify and focus our foreign aid to have a better and effective, more effective and efficient foreign assistance. And if we go through the foreign aid assistance since the union till date, you will see the three categories of the UAE aid, either humanitarian, development, or charity, flagship by the development, with 88% of the UAE foreign aid is development, and that would give you another indication that how effective is the UAE foreign assistance, where we focus on the growth of the country and the individual, starting from the individual to the growth of the economy and the whole country development. From 2010, it's worth mentioning that from 2010 to 2021, the UAE foreign assistance was around 55.6 billion US dollar, and that's a huge amount for such I would say new country. And it's also the UAE been the top donors since then. As a matter of fact, the UAE was top donor in 2013, 14, 15, 16, the number one donor in terms of the official development aid versus GNI. And with that, I would love to mention that there is perhaps some of the attendees, they don't know what do we mean by that. There is now that everything is systematic. There is the foreign aid assistance was standardized by international organization, and the international world, they agreed that for any country, 0.7% of their gross national income must go for official development aid. And guess what? The UAE exceeded the UAE exceeded 1% since then, and we've been in this number for so long. About the UAE aid, the UAE aid covers geographically the whole earth, from east to west, north to south. It wasn't designed to be meant for only the neighboring countries, or just countries or peoples with the common, I would say, interest or common language or common culture. No, it was basically based on the humanity. So when we provide an assistance, we provide it on a need base, regardless of religion, regardless of race, regardless of anything. As a matter of fact, also the UAE, when we design our programs, we design it based on the best interest of the countries. And probably you know that in every sector, when we do the design thinking of any program, we go based on the needs of the recipient, and that's very important element, just to assure the best and the most effective and efficient way. The themes of the UAE diverse from health, education, hunger, and all other human needs. And if you go like we've been participating in the UAE government meetings every year. And as we celebrate the year of 50, I think we should look and forecast what would be the needs of the future. The UAE was there to forecast it, and honestly, no better example than the UAE global response to COVID-19. Where when the countries were locking down and airports are shut, but the UAE started a national plan along with international response plan to COVID-19. And by today, since March 2020 till date, the UAE supported more than 135 countries to fight the coronavirus. We provided more than 2,000 tons of medical supplies, and we continue to do so. And we had more than 180 flights. We deliver aid by planes, by ships, sea, lands, all ways. It's just to ensure that the UAE aids reach the last person in need. And honestly, we haven't just being selective in that way. We've been assigning those aid to countries that's out of our reach. I mean, the Pacific countries, the Caribbean, the people in the Amazon. We had a flight from the UAE to Biro, and from Biro to 7 days on the trucks, and then they went to vessels and the Amazon River for another 14 days just to get the aids to the people of Amazon. That's a huge story. We wouldn't bother to do that, but to make sure that the UAE, when we deliver aid, we deliver it based on the needs without considering any race or culture or any rationale, I would say, beside the human needs. With the time that left to me, I just want to give an example also of the UAE humanitarian need and the tolerance. The UAE was the first country to respond to the catastrophe that happened to the Yazidi people in Sinjar. Those people were attacked by ISIS, not because of anything, just because of their religion. They're not Muslims. And the best way to respond to that is to respond by I would say a Muslim country, and we supported them. We were part of the initiative in Sinjar, and we supported the humanitarian work. We supported the Yazidi people, and also in Mosul, another example, when ISIS attacked the Al-Nouri Mosque and Al-Tahira Church, the UAE were first to rebuild it, and we've seen it all 2 months ago when the Pope Francis visited Al-Mosul. He prayed on that church the UAE rebuilt. I'm sorry if I took long, but honestly, this is the UAE. We promoting the UAE aid and foreign aid is only to promote peace and prosperity. We believe that the prosperity of the regional country, of the other countries, is the prosperity of the UAE, is the prosperity of the world, and the peace around us is the peace globally. Thank you very much, and I would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. شكرا جزيلا معالي الأستاذ راشد.
Mr. Rashid. it's it goes without saying that the role of the UAE in humanitarian aid is great, and the keep the integration that we find between the government efforts and the private sector in providing these assistances and help in different directions. The second speaker is Mr. Hamad Al-Kabi. He's Al Ittihad newspaper editor-in-chief, and he's going to discuss media and the culture of humanitarian work. Mr. Hamad, the floor is yours. 10 minutes. First of all, I would like to thank Trends Research Advisory for organizing this event, which is, for my point of view, is key event, particularly in this time that we are in. I would like to also to thank Dr. Mohammed Al Ali, the CEO of Trends, for his initiatives and support for the media sector in general, and the involvement and engagement of the media sector in all the events. First of all, I would like to discuss or raise the point of the integration between humanitarian work and media. Um, what I found from this theme that these two factors can be the seeds for international peace and communities that can resist terrorism and extremism. And this can be under the umbrella of enhancing the noble values that characterize the UAE community, when one of them is the donation and the giving value, which was instilled by His Highness late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, who believed in the importance of giving and stretching hands to the others, regardless their religion, their race, or their origin. And also, there are many experiences introduced by the UAE media in the field of humanitarian work, and in fostering the needs of the readers and followers about the importance of these initiatives, particularly that the leadership in the UAE was role model and positive role model for humanitarian work in the last 5 decades, which was non-stop. They were stretching all over the world to give the need and the help all over the globe. We find the UAE is always in the beginning, regardless as I said, the location or religion or culture. What I say is the media is the mirror that reflects the strategies and visions of the communities adopted by the decision makers. We say that the local media is characterized that they have real experiences that they need to highlight through the spread of the culture of humanitarian work. And as I said before, it emanates from the values of the UAE. Again, what characterizes the UAE is that it has a number of organizations and institutions, and that we have more than 40 humanitarian organizations and institutions work daily to provide giving or to give and provide humanitarian work across all the domains. And on top of these institutions, we see that, of course, the Red Crescent, which has a long history in providing humanitarian support and humanitarian aid, and always doing initiatives not only in the local level but also on the regional and international levels. I say they are outreaching all the places, remote places, all the time. And I say again that the UAE is in 2017 that designated a whole year for humanitarian work, which is called the Year of Goodness, which was an opportunity to provide more initiatives for humanitarian work. And as I said, there have been lots of rich experiences in voluntary work and supporting the moral issues all over the world. You know that the UAE media, they have rich experience in, if we try to monitor or to identify, we find like more than 90 programs were handling the humanitarian work in the UAE media. There are like hundreds of thousands of hours of broadcast to enhance this value, the positive value in the UAE, as the culture of humanitarian work. There are programs that were fully designated to this topic. We can, just for example, but not limited to, there is a program called Qalbi Itma'an, my heart got comforted. So this is one of the programs that highlights these morals and these values. And also, I, as example, that during addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, the media highlighted how the UAE selected this approach to provide assistance and provide help to other countries to address this pandemic. As the previous speaker said, they reached like 180 countries to provide the assistance and help, particularly when we know that most of the borders were closed and the flights were canceled. But despite these difficulties, the UAE insisted on providing the help, and the media was a partner in this, and they highlighted this effort. Well, we say that the media here is to support the humanitarian work and trigger the initiatives to handle this, and also enhance the humanitarian culture and the culture of humanitarian work. We see that the doctors, they do their role in curing the sick people, and also the media will play the similar role by helping the community and highlighting the roles and providing assistance to the others. We say this mission, the media mission, is to enhance this culture, and I have four hypotheses for this: is to establish that humanitarian work can be a lever to raise the tolerance and positive coexistence. When we say that we stretch hands to help others outside and here, unless we have this belief about the importance of the coexistence with others and help the others to relieve their pains. And also we say that it's the humanitarian work is a method or an approach to handle the conflicts and resolve these conflicts. I would say that we have so many examples that were in history to overcome these conflicts. We say that humanitarian work whether inside the borders or across borders will promote the concept of the common cause or the common interest. The fourth, we have support and encouraging the humanitarian work through media will ensure that we have new generation open for the others, and they really understand the concerns of their communities and the other communities. And in this way, the media will play a positive role in addressing or having the openness and avoid the extremism and other bad implications. When we have this, our communities will stand strong against extremism. And I would like to say at the end that we need to highlight the humanitarian work in media because this is a real value that needs to be established for the audience through real experiences or presenting real experiences as we have in the UAE. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamad, for your contribution. So I really like the four factors that you highlighted at the end, and I think we are going to have more questions about this in the Q&A. And I also agree with you that the role of media is very important in, especially in the conflicts that we have at the moment, particularly during the pandemics. You know, what countries started to look really or focus inside, not outside. And that we say that media should highlight how we should help the other and believe in coexistence and think about the things that will gather us together. Maybe we will have like 2 or 3 questions at the end, but right now we will move to Mr. Abdulaziz Al Zaidi. He's the head of programs department, Zaid Charitable and Humanitarian Foundation. He will talk about the UAE model in humanitarian assistance. Uh, I would like to thank you very much, and I would like to welcome all the attendees. I would like to thank you very much again and thank Trends for conducting this event during such holidays. And as we know, we are in Ramadan right now, and when we talk about humanitarian work and sustainable development in the UAE, I would say the UAE approach in providing the assistance, we always remember His Highness late Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan, because he was the one who established the values of this through openness with the world in order to for peace to prevail, and also to help the vulnerable and support the friends and fraternal countries. Now, today we know that the leadership are providing all capabilities to help the other countries, particularly those underdeveloped countries. When we talk about continents, we usually say that some continents that need, maybe this is one of the values that was established by His Highness late Sheikh Zayed. We know that the UAE is always providing a role model in the fields that it tackles. So when we talk about the UAE in the field of humanitarian work and development work, we have so many institutions, like, as we said, the Red Crescent and other institutions in the UAE. We would say the assistance that we give, or the UAE gave, aims to enhance the quality of life for the needy and vulnerable segments, regardless the race or religion or culture. And as Mr. Rashid talked, he said that the UAE in the last few years has always been #1 in the world, exceeding all the countries. And today, when we talk about this, and we know that we have the Day of Humanitarian Affairs, this is called Zaid Day for humanitarian work in the UAE. When we talk about the humanitarian work, we need to just highlight some real examples from the UAE and the implementation of best practices. The Sheikh Zayed, late Sheikh Zayed, he believed when he traveled to any country, he was asking asking about the needs, and then he asks to start sustainable project to address these needs in these countries. We know that he always did this on his own cost. He paid for this, and with the increase in the number of projects in 1992, he ordered to establish Zayed bin Sultan Charitable Organization to be a charitable organization and humanitarian organization to manage the projects in an organizational way. And he had the budget for this organization in order to cover the charitable work, whether in the UAE or all over the world. You see here the vision of His Highness in the sustainability of charity. This comes from his strong belief in the teaching of Islam that honored human beings without discrimination. Today, the organization, as per the direction of Sheikh Nayam bin Zayed, the director, um, and also the follow-up of Mr. Zayed bin Hamd Kardous Al-Amri, we pursue the delivery of our objectives. Now, the organization has a number of projects covering about 182 countries, and we see the statistics, the final statistics, we exceeded this number, but as an organization, we say the organization itself has 180, covering 180 countries. We say these figures were from the beginning of the day one, we have more than 1,500,000,000 for that were spent on the projects across the globe. When we talk about the international assistance, this is going to take a long story. We can't just summarize it all in a few minutes, but we say that what we are providing across the globe or overseas or inside the country, that has a very good impact in the recovery of the pandemic across the world. All the entities are racing through based on the directions of the leadership and their support in order to translate the humanitarian initiatives into sustainable work. We say that the UAE has really created initiatives in humanitarian aspect, and that was translated into sustainable project. Say the Dubai Initiative for Giving now started as initiative, and now it's an organization, independent organization, and also for the eyes. Uh, we say that we start as initiative and then they turn after that or change into an independent institution that continue and sustain the work in this field or this domain. We say that we're always happy in giving. We are lucky that we are working in the relief of the suffering of others in the UAE. And I would like to thank you again for hosting this event and giving us the opportunity to meet such elite personnel. Thank you, Mr. Abdelaziz, and thank you very much for your contribution. I had just one point about what you said about the implementation of best practices in the humanitarian work. This may be a question that we will tackle in the Q&A session, because it's very important that we highlight the best practices. We can also highlight the UAE experience and roll it out, or just think about how to roll it out to other countries as it really achieved the success. And we say that some countries with economy that's larger than the UAE maybe didn't achieve this or couldn't reach this point. Now,
English speaking. So I think it's at this time we need to switch back to the original language. So you can hear for the Arabic speakers, you can switch to the Arabic translation if you want to hear the Arabic translation of the English presentations. Our next speaker is Professor Mukesh Kapila. He is Professor Emeritus of Global Health and Humanitarian Affairs at the University of Manchester in the UK. And his talk will be the impact of the pandemics on humanitarian work. So it's going to elaborate on how the pandemics and times of crisis impact the humanitarian work across the globe. Professor Kapila, you have 10 minutes-ish to cover your topics.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting me to participate. And I'd like to appreciate the very good humanitarian leadership that is being shown by the UAE, both through the government and the many kind foundations that are hosted in the country. Now, my role is to talk a little bit about humanitarian work and its interactions with pandemics. And let me start by saying that humanitarian work is usually defined as assistance that is focused on the poorest, most vulnerable, and marginalized or stigmatized segments of society. These groups require special effort because they're often hard to reach due to policy or administrative constraints, which mean that formally organized social services by the state are not configured to serve them properly. Faced with this neglect by state institutions, affected people learn to become resourceful and resilient because they're obliged to cope as best as they can. Often, this is a precarious existence at the margins of society. Therefore, when a new shock comes, especially one that is sharp and sudden, their coping capacities are quickly overwhelmed. The result is a plunge into humanitarian crisis. The global COVID pandemic is such a new, sharp, and sudden shock. That is why the most devastating impacts of the coronavirus have been on the poorer, more vulnerable people. This is for direct and indirect reasons. The direct reason is that the risk factors that make individuals and their families and communities more vulnerable to catching and spreading lethal infectious diseases are more concentrated there due to poverty and environmental conditions. The indirect reason is that pandemics expand the size of populations of humanitarian concern. Billions have been affected in this way by COVID-19. First, those who were already defined as populations of humanitarian concern have seen their conditions worsen, such as war and disaster-affected groups, refugees, displaced and forced migrants. Second, new populations of humanitarian concern have been created. They are those who lost their livelihoods due to prolonged and widespread economic lockdowns, and also those special demographic groups, such as the elderly or those with chronic conditions, who were forced to be isolated, and thereby they lost their support systems. Now, worldwide pandemics such as COVID-19 and previously HIV and AIDS, as well as regional epidemics such as Ebola in West Africa, have crystallized an uncomfortable recognition. This is that when there is a generalized threat to society, policymakers feel obliged to impose restrictions based on the argument of having to serve the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Such logic implies sacrificing some minority considerations. It's therefore no surprise that pandemics have always impacted negatively on populations of humanitarian concern because they are at the lowest and often hidden level of the social pyramid. Now, good governance dictates that when a segment of society is disadvantaged by the deliberate application of public policy, the state should take adequate mitigation measures. But during the COVID pandemic, many states have done that through fiscal and welfare policies, but poorer nations have not been able to make either adequate compensatory provision or to sustain them. This pandemic is proving to be a long haul and is set to continue for some time. So how does the humanitarian sector then respond? Now, all humanitarian crises bring out the best among humanitarians. And we've seen this time and time again during wars, disasters, and now pandemics. Very often that means taking extra risks for the humanitarians who have even paid with their lives, as seen with the many doctors and nurses who have died from COVID, Ebola, or other such conditions. However, individual sacrifice can't make up for the failure of the humanitarian system as a whole. The humanitarian system as a whole has failed in dealing with the challenge of pandemics. It has tried its best, but its efforts have been relatively small and ad hoc. That is so for a number of reasons. First, because its donor-based financing model makes it entirely dependent on governments and a few large foundations that contribute the most. When donor economies suffer from the inevitable economic consequences of lockdowns, they cut aid or redirect it towards direct health actions or medical research into a new threat. This inevitably means reduced resourcing for other equally essential humanitarian interventions. Second, the humanitarian system fails because it is highly centralized. It means that donor governments favor international organizations including their own large international NGOs, for reasons of administrative convenience or accountability, as well as because of a lack of trust in local bodies in recipient countries. Inevitably, international agencies are remote in geographical and cultural terms from those who they seek to help. And unavoidably, international organizations tend to be cumbersome, costly, slow, and insensitive to the many grades of local needs. Third, they fail because the bureaucracies of large humanitarian organizations are increasingly risk averse. They fear insecurity and danger for their international staff, and they also worry about diseases that their workers could catch, and for which they can't be insured or may even get sued. The result is that international agencies transfer risks that they won't bear themselves to local staff, who of course are generally inadequately insured or otherwise protected. This is obviously unfair and discriminatory. Fourth, they fail because their prevalent operational model favors short-term inputs and quick returns in terms of lives saved or helped, instead of longer-term investment in preparedness and capacity building to generate locally viable and sustainable humanitarian responses and meaningful solutions to crises. Fifth, they fail because new technologies that are being deployed in humanitarian delivery are creating as many new gaps as old gaps are being bridged. Thus, while digital connectivity and new approaches such as cash instead of in-kind assistance are a great advance, the digital divide is worse for populations who don't or can't access the internet or can't afford high data costs. That is in addition to the increasing censorship imposed by totalitarian states, especially during crises, as they seek to mute criticism of failing states. Sixth, traditional humanitarians that are vested in the principles of neutrality and impartiality, which are the bedrock of the response model. Right as that is, it means, however, that they're increasingly helpless in the age of brutality, where egregious human rights abuses are the normalized accompaniment of crises. They can't speak up, humanitarians can't speak up or resist injustice that cause many crises nowadays, because that is against their code of conduct. Therefore, humanitarians are increasingly reduced nowadays to simply pick up the pieces at best. Or worse than that, their working protocol has the consequence that they become alibi providers for crisis-generating regimes, or unintentionally even appearing to connive with them. COVID-19 related restrictions of freedoms and militarized responses that have been justified by many authorities on health grounds have simply served legitimized rights violations and risk leaving a permanent legacy in the creeping authoritarianism we see in all corners of the world. Seventh, in a perfect storm created by all the other factors coming together, is a self-serving logic of the prevailing global humanitarian model that relies on generating a vicious circle of dependency so that a vast network of external humanitarian agencies can justify themselves. To be fair, this is not a deliberate, wicked conspiracy that some evil mastermind has conceived. It is just a logical consequence of a system that has grown over many decades and has not been incentivized correctly to reform and modernize itself, even as the world it seeks to serve has profoundly altered through a combination of geopolitical, environmental, and population trends. The pandemic has quite simply heightened the contradiction of those pre-existing trends. In the immediate short term of COVID-19, that was because of the physical disruption of the humanitarian delivery model, which meant that external humanitarian workers and supplies couldn't deliver, while humanitarian funding took a knock as the richer world sought to look after its own, including now with vaccines, as we are seeing now everywhere. But looking to the future, where does this take us in the longer term? There are reform solutions on offer that are, in contemporary language, around the decolonization of humanitarian aid. Will the COVID pandemic provide a much needed shock that will catalyze a grand reset for humanitarian work? So far, the trend is not hopeful, but there are several crucial seeds from which a better post-pandemic humanitarianism could emerge. First, this is by recognizing that resources for assistance are always going to be limited. That makes it important to have an objective, impartial, and independent system that conducts needs monitoring, assessment, and accountability. In such a system, there is a division of powers so that the same agencies are not deciding on who is to receive help, how much help they need, and then evaluating their own performance. You can't be judge, jury, and executioner in the same case. That is not justice. In an already unequal and unfair world, it is important that we correct current arrangements so as to regain lost confidence and trust. Survey after survey around the world has shown that even though humanitarian recipients are grateful for the help they have been given, they are sometimes resentful and don't trust the providers of the assistance. Second, recognizing that the current humanitarian transaction chains are cumbersome and inefficient, they must be shortened by connecting the donor and the needy recipient as directly as possible. The technology of cash transfers to individual families can help here, as well as localization to agencies providing direct services on the ground. That means cutting out those middle agencies that don't provide direct services, but simply subcontract to others, because these increase the cost of delivery and reduce the value of benefits received at the end of the chain. Third, a global humanitarian financing system is needed for people caught up in those humanitarian crises generated by common planetary failures, such, for example, as climate change, which is growing, and of course, pandemics, because the solution to these global failures required the creation and fair distribution of common global goods. There is an argument to be made here for such a special provision for humanitarian challenges that come out from these global failures, because they affect all of us. And no one is safe until all are safe. Of course, there are many other improvements that could enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the humanitarian system. In the current time of many simultaneous complex challenges, of which pandemics are just one. But tinkering at the margins is unlikely to achieve much when we actually need a brand new humanitarian dispensation for the age we live in. In conclusion, let me say that the United Arab Emirates has pioneered many advances, and its generosity is an example to countries all over the world. Now I would urge my friends in the Emirates to join also in trying to bring about wider improvements in the humanitarian system so that the lessons of the pandemic are reflected in a longer-term improvement for the whole of humanity everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Capella. And I think as I was listening to all the challenges you raised, and I was hoping for kind of the other side of the story, and I did very well and in a very positive note there. So definitely a lot of challenges facing the humanitarian work that needs to be addressed. And as I said in one of the comments, that the UAE seems to have cracked the code on some of them. So maybe sharing the efforts and working globally to address those issues is part of the solution. Last but not least, Jacob Kutzer is the Director of Humanitarian Agenda at the Center for Strategic and International Studies from the US, and he's going to talk about sustainable development, the agenda for sustainable development and the agenda for humanity, and address the complementary relationship between the two. Jacob, I think it's unfair that you got the help from the little ones. You know, that wasn't part of the deal. So now you have. I'll give you an extra 2 minutes if you want.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, and to our viewers and our co-panelists who are celebrating Ramadan Mubarak. I could just save us some time and go straight to Q&A by saying I associate myself with Professor Kapila's remarks because I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of a lot of the necessary transformations needed in the humanitarian sector and some of the innovations. Before I reached out to my prepared remarks, so, you know, when I was listening to the previous speakers, we're talking today about humanitarian issues and development issues. And I think one thing that I was thinking about was that the COVID experience has reinforced for me and reinforced for all of us that humanitarian issues are not necessarily something that happens over there. We talk quite a bit about helping them. And I think especially, where I'm coming from in the United States, even in Washington, D.C., what we've seen is that there are humanitarian issues at home, there are development issues at home. And I think what the challenge is not just localizing the international response, connecting the donors more directly with the recipients in countries that are affected by climate or conflict, but rather connecting the work that we in the United States and you in the UAE are doing internationally with the needs at home. We know that these things are all connected. We know that there's vulnerability. And we also know that in our assessments of humanitarian issues in the United States, we're no longer looking at the assessment of the US as a humanitarian actor just based on how much money we're spending and just based on how well we're spending it, but we're also situating it within a much broader framework of how does our humanitarian portfolio fit into the totality of our political context, domestically and abroad? How does the humanitarian portfolio internationally fit into our other foreign policy and national security imperatives? And how does our humanitarian portfolio line up against the needs of our most vulnerable communities in the United States, be they urban, rural, and Native American reservations and elsewhere? So I think we have a lot to think about in terms of localization, but not just there, but also back at home. To the comments that I prepared in my initial thinking about this, we talked about the title talks about humanitarian work and sustainable development and how these things can be complementary. In 2015, when they launched the Sustainable Development Goals, they committed to fostering peaceful, just, and inclusive societies free from fear and violence. And it said there's no sustainable development without peace. Around the same period of time, the World Humanitarian Summit launched the initiative we know as the Grand Bargain, which was, an agreement between the largest donors and humanitarian organizations to improve the efficiency of humanitarian aid, which Mukesh spoke about quite effectively, some of the failures of that initiative. And the outcomes of both the World Humanitarian Summit and the Agenda for Humanity were this principle of no one left behind. For the humanitarian community, that's translated to commitments to a better way of working that not only shifts and connects funding from humanitarian and development programs together, but also calls for working collaboratively across institutional boundaries. That could also be across international boundaries, but not deviating from these principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And the provision of humanitarian assistance is often seen as the first step towards securing the stability necessary for meaningful and sustainable development. If people are suffering and are unable to access basic needs, you can't really think about getting to longer term development gains. And yet we've seen as well that in the last few years, the proliferation of armed conflict, compounded by the increase in scale of climactic shocks, and now most recently, the pandemic is straining the existing humanitarian resources, making that first step in the chain even more complicated. When we talk about these complex crises, we're talking about situations where are characterized by an extensive loss of life and widespread displacement, damaged economies, and these pose unique operational challenges for the humanitarian system. Within these conflicts, the denial of humanitarian access is one of the most severe challenges. This is purely a political decision. Sure, humanitarian access can be denied or can be challenged by infrastructure or logistics, but more often than not, state and non-state actors alike are denying or hindering or diverting aid from reaching vulnerable populations. So there's political security steps that are being taken to stop this first step in a chain towards sustainable development. COVID itself has created new and additional barriers. We talked about the closing of borders, movement restrictions, hoarding of essential supplies, has also created new flashpoints for conflicts. However, the domestic responses during COVID also offer opportunities for learning and studying alternative models of humanitarian action, as national and local first responders shouldered additional responsibility in managing that response. As efforts to harmonize and ensure coherence between humanitarian action and sustainable development continue, the question over which actors are best equipped to address the needs of vulnerable populations takes on increased salience And we have to learn from this forced test that we had. We were forced to test. The internationals were sent home, and we had the opportunity to study and see the true capability of the community groups, the religious groups, the local neighborhood societies, the local organizations that stepped up. And so learning the lessons from this more domestic-led response to the COVID-19 pandemic can also provide us meaningful insight and a direction for our future efforts towards local and humanitarian action. When we think about this, context is the largest variable in examining the linkages between humanitarian assistance and development goals. There is no one-size-fits-all policy, no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to the localization of the humanitarian response or the transitioning from humanitarian to development programs. In Afghanistan, for example, humanitarian actors have better access to people in need when they carry out their work consistent with the principled stance of neutrality and independence, whereas development actors have a harder time because they're perceived by some parties to the conflict for being closer to the government of the United States. However, the situation in Jordan and Lebanon after the Syrian refugee influx brought together humanitarian and development actors to work collectively on issues of supporting a large number of refugees through improved access to livelihoods and economic opportunity. Today, the average lifespan of a refugee camp has moved to nearly 20 years, and refugees often spend more than 10 years away from their homes and are seen as a financial burden. But the Jordan Compact came together largely due to political will, and it was one of the first significant efforts to extend labor market access and education to refugees as part of a response to a protracted displacement crisis, and a focus on inclusive growth. And this is a crucial component towards achieving some of those development gains, not just for the Syrian refugees in Jordan, but for the totality of the Jordanian society. So while humanitarian action can be seen as a prerequisite for sustainable development, we also know it's not fully equipped to take on the complexity that a post-conflict reconstruction development environment entails. The conversation around bridging the gap between the various actors and the role of humanitarian and development approaches has been central to initiatives like the World Bank's Fragility and Conflict Partnership Trust Fund, which seeks to strengthen the links between political, security, development, and humanitarian efforts. The ongoing discussion about a humanitarian development and peace nexus is a more recent proposition for a comprehensive response that has begun to be piloted in a variety of contexts. There's also been developed an approach to the humanitarian system that Professor Kapila spoke about, talking about cash transfer and longer-term investment and addressing the systemic causes of vulnerability as opposed to responding just to the symptoms. Before I reach a conclusion, I want to add a word on gender inequality, which tends to be reinforced by crisis and was raised by a number of our previous speakers. In the past few years, humanitarian and peace initiatives have prioritized an analysis of gender relationships and women's participation to minimize risks of doing additional harm. We know that women have been increasingly hit economically by the impact of COVID-19. Women tend to work, nearly 60% of women in conflict-affected countries work in the informal economy, which puts them at greater risk of falling into poverty. And in line with the fifth Sustainable Development Goal of gender equality, the implementation of this approach is an opportunity to support women's rights organizations and ensure that women's participation is integral to both the immediate responses and the longer term outcomes. And that means that women must not just be recipients, but also part of the planning, discussion, and analysis of humanitarian and development work. Just to conclude, in addition to the formal partnerships that we've discussed, a report by OCHA in 2016, Leaving No One Behind, described various ways in which the gap between humanitarian and development actors can be bridged in line with sustainable development goals. And they talked about reinforcing national actors and enabling them to take ownership of the response, having a clearly defined exit strategy to limit dependency, facilitating coordination and communication between national, subnational, and international actors early on in a response, and promoting a sense of shared accountability. And in essence, these frameworks and compacts are all useful in building this more inclusive, just, and safe world. However, none of these can be truly successful without the political will and the buy-in by the states and governments that are also contributing to situations of armed conflict. And I include the United States as first and foremost in that regard. because what we're ultimately talking about is a future of peace. And if addressing humanitarian crises is the root cause for sustainable development, so is addressing the root causes of these crises. And we need a substantial amount of increased political will to tackle not just the technicalities of humanitarian action or the complementarity of humanitarian and development work, but actually really getting to the root cause of these conflicts, bringing parties to the table, negotiating just and sustainable solutions, and creating the peaceful conditions that will allow the humanitarian work, that will allow the transition to the development work, that will create the future that we all strive for. So with that, I'll conclude.
Very much, Jacob, and I think you kind of summed it up very well, and you helped me kind of lead into the first question. And just for the sake of facilitating the conversation, I'm going to ask a couple of questions in English for Professor Kapila, Jacob, and Rashid, and then we have a few questions in Arabic. يعني أسئلة بالإنجليش بالإنجليزية في الأول وأسئلة بالعربي في الآخر حتى نسهل على المترجمين. My first question is, you talk about, I think for Jacob and Professor Kapila and even Rashid, you talk about reinforcing the national actors, or have an exit strategy so that you limit the dependency. And I think Professor Kapila talked about the need for a new model for this whole humanitarian aid work. My question to you is, how do you balance the immediate needs of the people? So all these poor countries that need immediate need during regular time or during the time of crisis, with the ineffectiveness of the government structure, the corruption, the lack of transparency, nepotism, et cetera, with the needs for sustainable development, with the needs to put that money into more development programs that will generate sustainable growth, income, and reduce the dependency on foreign aid. How do you balance that? Professor Kapila, maybe you can start us.
I think 2 points in the answer. The first is that all through history, immediate needs are always met by local people. By the time anybody else comes along, it's far too late, whether it's digging people out of an earthquake or meeting their immediate needs for survival, food, etc. Right? Mm-hmm. I think, and that has to be reinforced by building local capabilities and also understanding that there are always local capabilities and to magnify them. The second part of my answer is that actually when people are affected by some kind of adversity or some problem, they're not going through an intellectual argument in their head saying, have I got a humanitarian problem? Have I got a development problem? Which peace nexus should I activate in order to sort out whatever is, whoever is attacking me at the moment? They take a problem-oriented approach to solving the issue of their own survival, welfare, and flourishing. So I would say it's important that we should break down these barriers between categories of assistance. And the best way to do that is to take a problem-oriented approach at the local level. And so, and this also means that the principles of humanitarianism, which we treasure a lot, even though I was a little bit critical about them, things like, for example, neutrality, impartiality. I mean, it's not about being critical of them. It is a question of interpreting them in the modern challenges of the world. Those principles of humanity should apply equally to the work of development. So in that sense, those are not humanitarian principles. Those are the principles of humanity. So in a sense, I think that integrated approach, which by the way is best pursued at the local level, it will not succeed. It will not work at the international level, because at the international level, we specialize in breaking the world up into its components, categorizing them, classifying them, and setting up institutions that create more division rather than more putting them together. That's why we have humanitarian organizations, we have development organizations. Now, in a national mission or a local mission, those divisions become irrelevant.
Jacob?
Yeah, thanks. I would just briefly say, I mean, I think there's one real technical problem, and which is, part of the problem here is that a substantial amount of this funding comes from governments and bureaucracies. And a lot of the conversation, I think, is focused at the wrong piece of the chain, right? Which is, for example, the EU Commissioner for Aid gave an interview a few months back where he was rightfully criticized for speaking inartfully about the capacities of local organizations. But he also made a key point, which I think people missed, which was they have to respond to their auditors, right? And governments, unfortunately, it's not USAID that sets up some of the authorization and appropriation structures. It's Congress, right? There are all sorts of rules and regulations that even USAID has to abide by. So we, in Washington, my job is, I'm not best suited to identify the local organization in Jordan or Somalia to respond to the needs of that crisis. My job is to figure out how to get the US government to be more nimble and faster and more capable of supporting them in the correct way. But I do think that this exit strategy concept, for better or for worse, you hurt yourself, you go to see a doctor, they help you, they don't then stand next to you, your broken arm, for months at a time, right? They send you back on your way. And I think what Mukesh mentioned about, these organizations that are there, the communities that respond in the immediate aftermath of a crisis, I think we're probably past the point of capacity building, and probably past the point of actually even, they're there, they're doing it. So what we need to do is a better job of identifying them and figuring out the tools that we have at our disposal to get the resources to those organizations, those individuals, whatever their defining structure might be, just faster and more effectively, and then getting out of the way.
So Rashid, the same question applies to you, but I would add, what is the foreign ministry doing to kind of sell the UAE model in humanitarian work? So we're talking about what's the best model to do, but an extension to that question to you is, what is the UAE doing in terms of promoting the UAE model outside of the UAE?
Well, I'll just refer back to, it's a very important question. I'll refer back to the bandwagon Jacob mentioned during the Humanitarian Summit in 2016. The world, the international community has agreed that the humanitarian needs are increasing, and they will keep increasing. I mean, last March, the WFP, along with the FAO organization, they announced their call for action with the need of $5.5 billion in 2021 just for the hunger. And you do the count about the rest of the sectors. With the 2021 have taught us that yes, indeed it will increase the humanitarian need. With the COVID crisis, with the climate change crisis, with the conflict all over the world. That would definitely increase the humanitarian need, and with that, you would need to respond. You would increase your response through international, through donors, through international organization, and the international community. The two things about them is first, as was mentioned throughout the session, that we have to look at the root cause of those, and we have to solve them. But yet, we have to consider as well that we will invest in humanitarian rather than increase our, I would say, our portion in humanitarian versus the development. This is the first thing. The second thing, in 2016 as well, the UAE has announced the UAE Technical Assistance Program, and basically this is an answer of what you're asking. What would the UAE do? The good thing about this, the UAE Technical Assistance Program, is based on the comparative advantage of the UAE. So we've been hearing a lot from other countries, what we want to be like UAE. How do we get there where the UAE has developed its sectors, its aviation sector, its mobility, infrastructure? And the answer wasn't just spending money just to be like the UAE. But no, we will share with you our capacity. And the thing about those countries that we support, I'll tell you, they don't want like African, Asian. They don't want to be like the US. They don't want to be like the UK. It's far from them. They want to see a very reasonable model, very adaptable model. The UAE, in 50 years, they achieved this progress, this development, and it wasn't because of kind of fun, but was proper governance. So I think, yeah, the UAE technical assistance program, referred to as UAE TAP, is basically it's a comparative advantage of the UAE share to the recipient country in 4 key sectors: government, energy and sustainability, mobility, infrastructure and mobility, and services, so financial services, hospitality, tourism, and others. And across them all, women empowerment, half of the society. You can't expect a development in any community or any country without involving 50% of its population. So this is the answer. This is the UA model. We share it. We share it with countries. We publish it actually, and we enrolled a lot of people in those programs. Over.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to switch to Arabic now. هذا عندي سؤالين.
To Arabic, I have 2 questions, one for Mr. Abdelaziz and Mr. Hamid, and the last question for Mr. Hamad Al-Kabi, because I received just a notification that we're out of time. So, Mr. Hamid and Mr. Abdelaziz, the Red Crescent in the UAE and the charitable organization are key institutions in the field of humanitarian work since decades, and you indicated the implementation of the best practices. So the question is, what are you doing in order to share these experiences with other partners, with other international partners and other organizations, and what are the key for selecting the projects or programs that you are adopting? So can you give me just separately, each one of you will give you your experience in this domain. Mr. Abdelaziz, you start first, or Mr. Hamid? So, Mr. Abdelaziz. We are at the organization, we always selected the projects as based on sustainability. So when we select a project or build a project or initiative, we think about the sustainable effort or the sustainable outcomes. We have also partners, identify partners. So we have the hydropower in Tajikistan. We, as I said, we selected the sustainable projects and we moved from one project to another. Right now, the organization, institutions, and associations are moving from project to another. They don't want to tie or link themselves to a project, a specific project in a country that you continue over 1 or 2 years. Then you let them depend on themselves to run the project and sustain the outputs. When we build a project like a hospital or a school at any country, we always have like endowment for this project in order to get revenue or budget for this project to cover the expenses. So we have projects for children in Kenya. We selected these projects, and as Mr. Hamid has more experience, he can add more to us, because he said project in Regeb, this project use alternative energy, solar energy. We usually try to implement the best practices in the projects and the selection of for example, solar energy or alternative energy sources to benefit for reduction of the cost and sustainability of the outcomes. Mr. Hamid? عفوا لا يوجد صوت من المصدر. No, there is not. Can you remove the mute? Can you unmute your mic? Yes. The projects that we are selecting are subject to studies, special studies for these projects, and we send delegations specialized to survey the situation and supervise the work, and also designate a supervisor from the country itself to be responsible for the supervision and overseeing. So, for example, if we wanted to build a hospital in a country, we would like to, or it is compulsory to partner or engage the Ministry of Health in this country to provide us with the information and the requirements, and also the specializations required. And based on these models and information, we try to add the touch of the modernity, and we add the concepts of the renewable energy, because it's more convenient in terms of cost. Maybe you pay extra money at the beginning, but on the long run, there will be less cost and it will be more cost efficient. After delivering or after finishing the project, it is delivered to the specialized entity, for example, the Ministry of Health, for in case of hospitals, because they will be responsible for managing these hospitals. We provide the medical equipment based on the needs of these hospitals, and the question always we address to the ministry or the competent entity: do you have the medical staff to operate this hospital or to operate these medical equipment, or we're going only to buy and stock it over there? So first of all, we just ask them if they have a specialist in operating or managing the medical equipment, and when we ensure the availability of the stuff, we get the suppliers of the equipment to provide the training for the staff, and later on we make the final handover to the ministry or to the competent entity. As I said, in case of hospitals, the Ministry of Health. Right now, for digging wells, for the wells that we are digging are totally operated by the solar energy, and as I said, this is much better than the traditional energy types. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamid. I have question for Mr. Hamad Al-Kaabi. You said that there were more than 90 programs in humanitarian work, and also hundreds of thousands of hours of broadcast for spreading the culture of humanitarian work. Right now, we're talking about the pandemic that hit the world. It just negatively impacted many countries on reducing their share in the assistance that they provide, and they started to focus internally on their own needs. So how can we convey this message for the next generation, and how can we just change this concept? As we said in the beginning, we said giving is a value, and one of the values, or the key values of the UAE community, and it's an ideal value for other communities. Always by giving, or with giving, human being can even get rid of his selfishness. So when they give, they don't wait for something in return. And this is the approach that we are following in the UAE. Always the UAE stretching its hand with giving, not waiting a response, not waiting something in return. We say that media always played a key role in establishing this culture, whether regionally or internationally or at the local level. And here we see the role of the media, because when Sheikh Zayed started, there are many stories that were told by the media, and some are not told yet in the media, about situations, noble situations of His Highness late Sheikh Zayed, when he helped the others, regardless their religion, their culture, their even political systems. So this is ideal value that, you know, it's one of the supreme values of the UAE. And when we help the others, when we stretch our hands with help to the others, this always media played a role in promoting this value. As I said again, regardless the difference in language, religion, approach, whatever, we have many situations or many previous experiences in the UAE where the UAE supported humanity and welfare of human being, not specific religion, not specific sector, not specific ideology. And sometimes they would say that there are many examples. We can't just give them all or just talk about them all right now. I would say that always media was accompanied in these campaigns, was playing a role in these campaigns, and showing that the assistance that is provided to the other should be just for the sake of humanity, not based on religion or culture or any other factor. Thank you very much, Mr. Hamad.
The time to connect with us. Jacob, really appreciate the early start to the day. Probably it's time to go get the kids some breakfast. I think this conversation has been quite enlightening. So the need for an integrated model for humanitarian aid, the need to kind of address the challenges that were kind of put forward by the COVID crisis, the need to empower the local content. As Dr. Kapila said, the need to kind of merge and think of the acts in its totality and not the development with the aid. I think we heard the story of the UAE in terms of leading the world in terms of development and the diversity in that spending for humanitarian aid, the role of the media in promoting that the concept of giving. And I think one thing that Said Abdulaziz said that is very true is the happiness and the satisfaction you get when you're doing a charitable act. And we all feel it individually, and I think as countries as well, when you're impacting people that are less favorable, people that fall through the net, it's a great feeling. The other thing is, one of you guys talked about the political will, and I think for me that's critical. So you could work the technicalities for the countries that are offering the money. You can try to address the issues at the host countries. But then there's a political will. When during this crisis, certain countries wanted to help the needy. So they went and actually found the list of the people who need that support. While just 2 or 3 years ago, they made the argument that they couldn't actually have a full list of all the people that needed help. So there are a lot of things that we covered. And I hope this conversation contributed to the debate about the integration between sustainable development and humanitarian aid. I'm going to switch to Arabic now. شكرا جزيلا على مشاركتكم يعني كانت
So thank you very much for your contributions, and it was very exciting event. Actually, I have more questions here, but we're out of time, so I'd like to thank you very much for your participation and your contribution. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdulaziz and Mr. Hamid, for the clarifications you made about your institutions that are well known in the field of the humanitarian work.